I was baking. Before I ever believed in anything, a preacher's daughter's secret life in the Colorado plains. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Colorado Territory, May of 1872. The land itself seemed carved out of hardship. The wind rolled across the plains like a restless spirit, dry and relentless, stirring up dust that clung to skin and stung the eyes. Fences leaned against the weight of years, and the soil cracked beneath boots that had walked too far without water. In this stark country, survival demanded more than strength. It demanded silence, patience, and a will to endure. Into this unforgiven place came Clara Evans, a woman with nothing but a canvas satchel and a heart heavy with secrets. She stepped down from the freight wagon boots, worn thin dress faded from long miles of travel. Her back was straight, though her hands were rough and her eyes shadowed. Clara had walked away from the only life she had known in Kansas, leaving behind the role of a preacher's daughter and the faith that had once steadied her. Whatever had broken inside her back home, she carried west with the hope that in a new place nobody would ask questions she couldn't answer. The freight wagon rattled away, leaving her alone on the dirt road that led toward the Hayes Ranch. Clara stood still for a moment, listening to the low creak of a corral and the shifting hooves of restless horses. Men worked in the distance with heads bent to their labor, but she did not wave and they did not look her way. She walked forward slowly, feeling the heat rise from the earth as the sun pressed down. Near the barn stood Samuel Hayes, the man who had sent for her. His figure was cut from the same cloth as the land, broad-shouldered, weathered, silent. He carried the air of a man who had seen too much loss to waste words. His hat shaded his eyes, but his gaze was sharp as it moved over her from head to boot. Clara braced herself, unflinching. "I need bread," he said finally, voice flat as stone. "Not stories." "I'm here for the work," Clara answered evenly. Her tone was quiet but steady. "I won't be in anyone's way." "The job's for 2 months," Samuel continued. "You'll bake every morning. Enough for the ranch hands and extra for Saturday market. You'll sleep in the shed near the south fence." He gestured to a small, weather-beaten building tucked beside the cattle barn. Clara nodded once. "When do I start?" He studied her for a beat longer, then added with a rough edge, "Keep to yourself. Don't go near my daughter." Her brow arched. "I don't plan on braiding anyone's hair." "She doesn't talk," Samuel said, tone clipped. "Hasn't since her mother died. That's not your concern. Do the job. Stay out of the rest." The words dropped between them like stones in water. Clara did not flinch. "I understand." By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, Clara stood inside the shed that would now be hers. It was cleaner than expected, one narrow cot, a stove, and a small window facing east. She set down her satchel, unwrapped her flour sealed in oilcloth, a tin of salt, and a wooden rolling pin polished smooth by her mother's hands. Each item was a piece of her past, the only part she had chosen to carry west. She lit a lantern, feeling its glow spread against the shadows of her new home. Before dawn, she was awake. The air bit at her fingers as she split kindling for the stove, but soon the fire was warm and her hands moved with familiar rhythm. Measure, mix, knead. Her muscles remembered even when her mind tried not to. The dough took shape under her palms, and though there was no sugar, it would rise and hold. By sunrise, the smell drifted through the ranch yard. She wiped flour across her apron just as Samuel returned from the barn. He picked up a roll, bit into it without a word, and chewed thoughtfully. At last he muttered, "Not bad." Clara met his eyes calm. I was baking before I ever believed in anything." He paused as if the words had struck somewhere beneath his armor, but he only said, "Don't forget what I told you before," turning back to the door. That night, Clara stepped outside the shed and noticed something left on the porch rail where she had set a small loaf earlier in the day. The bread was gone, but in its place lay a single white flower, fragile and deliberate. She touched the petals lightly, her throat tight. The prairie did not shout, it whispered, and sometimes a whisper was louder than any sermon. As the days unfolded, her work settled into rhythm. Long before the rooster crowed, Clara's oven glowed. Her hands bore new blisters, but her bread grew stronger, her loaves consistent. The ranch hands ate without complaint. Samuel remained distant, though his gaze lingered more often than he intended. And at the edge of the barn, a little girl with tangled blonde hair stood watching. Abigail Hayes, no older than 4, clutched a ragged doll against her chest. She did not speak. She only stared with wary eyes that carried more grief than a child should know. Clara never beckoned her, never broke the silence. Instead, she began leaving a small round loaf each morning on the porch rail. No words, no invitation. By nightfall, the loaf was always gone. Clara told herself it was just bread, just habit. But in the quiet of her shed, when the wind whispered through the grass, she began to wonder if maybe this place had called her for more than work. Maybe healing sometimes rose like dough, slow, patient, and invisible at first. The rhythm of mornings on the Hayes Ranch became the measure of Clara Evans's new life. Long before the sun climbed over the ridges, while the ranch hands still slept, and only the rooster cried against the darkness, she was awake. Her shed glowed faintly from the fire she had rebuilt in the stone oven, her hands white with flour, the air warm with the smell of bread rising. Each day she worked with quiet precision. Fold press roll score the motions gave her purpose even when her thoughts threatened to drift back to the life she had left behind. The bread was more than food. It was an anchor, something steady in a world where she was determined not to let grief claim her as it had once before. By dawn, her baskets were full, 8 loaves for the ranch hands, 2 for market, and 1 small round she never mentioned to Samuel. That loaf she wrapped in a square of faded cloth and set down each morning at the base of the old swing hanging from a cottonwood tree behind the barn. The swing was where little Abigail sat most often silent as the land itself, her hair tangled by the wind, her doll tucked against her chest. She never spoke, never reached out. She only watched. Clara never tried to coax her, never forced conversation. Instead, she left the bread like a quiet offering and went back to her oven. By evening, the loaf was always gone and the cloth left folded neatly on the porch rail. Samuel noticed. Sometimes she caught him leaning against a fence post, arms crossed, watching from a distance. His jaw stayed tight and his expression never changed, but he didn't stop her. He didn't thank her either. In a place where words were rare and honesty lived in silence, his watching was enough. Then, one afternoon, the wind betrayed her. It swept in from the east hard and hot and carried a live ember from her oven into a pile of straw stacked beside the shed. In an instant, the straw caught flames snapping up like angry fingers reaching for the sky. Clara dropped the pan she carried and lunged for a pail of water, shouting, "No, no," as the fire leapt toward the woodpile. Her skirts brushed the heat as she tried to beat down the flames with wet burlap. The smoke burned her eyes and panic clawed at her throat. Just when she thought the blaze would outrun her boots, thundered across the dirt. Samuel appeared through the haze coat, already pulled over his mouth, another pail in hand. Without hesitation, he charged into the fire, dousing the flames and stomping at sparks with heavy boots. Clara fought beside him, coffin eyes watering until the smoke thinned and the fire finally fell silent. They stood, bent over, lungs burning, clothes smudged with soot. Clara's right hand was raw and red where the heat had caught her. "Let me see," Samuel said, reaching for her wrist. "It's fine," she insisted, but the sting made her flinch. "Let me," he repeated softer this time. She surrendered her hand. From his coat pocket, he pulled a small tin of salve. His fingers, rough from years of work, moved with surprising gentleness as he spread the balm across her palm. Clara's breath caught not from the pain, but from the unexpected tenderness of his touch. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I didn't need someone to save my oven either," he muttered, his voice low, almost gruff. "But you did." Their eyes met through the drifting smoke, not as employer and hired hand, but as two people bound for a moment by something neither could name. Then he stood abruptly, brushing ash from his sleeves, and walked back toward the barn. Clara watched him go, heart unsettled, unsure whether to feel shaken or steadied by what had just passed. The next morning, the swing swayed gently, and the bread she left there disappeared once more. But this time, Abigail was different. She stood closer to the shed, closer to Clara, her doll tucked beneath one arm. Her blue eyes lingered not just on the bread, but on Clara's hands as they worked the dough. Clara glanced down at her flour-streaked palms, then back at the child. "Do you want to help?" she asked softly, not expecting an answer. For a long moment, Abigail stood frozen. Then, without a word, she stepped closer. Small fingers reached into the flour bowl, pressing into the dough like it was something alive. Clara's heart swelled. She tore off a small lump, rolled it flat, and shaped it into a sun with rays before handing the dull knife to the little girl. "Your turn," Clara said. Abigail hesitated, then carved something uneven, 4 legs, a tail, and a long neck. Clara tilted her head. A horse. The child gave the faintest nod. For the next hour, they shaped cats with crooked smiles, birds with bent wings, stars, and lopsided hearts. Abigail's tongue peeked from the corner of her mouth as she worked the concentration in her face stronger than words could have been. When the figures browned in the oven, Clara whispered, "Now comes the magic." Together, they knelt, watching through the oven's open mouth. Heat shimmered, dough expanding, edges curling golden. Then one of the little horses puffed too wide, tipped sideways, and landed belly up. Clara gasped softly. Abigail blinked once and then laughed. It wasn't loud, wasn't long, but it was real. High-pitched and airy, a sound like sunlight breaking through cloud. The sound froze Clara where she knelt. She turned slowly toward the girl, eyes wide with wonder. Abigail clapped her hand over her mouth, startled at her own voice. But Clara only smiled, reaching into the oven to pull out the misshapen horse. "It's the first one I've ever seen lie down after a long ride," she murmured gently. From the window of the main house, Samuel stood still, watching them. He didn't speak, didn't move. But when Abigail's laughter carried across the yard, his hand tightened on the windowsill. Before he turned away, his face shadowed in thought. That evening, Clara found a bundle of dry wood stacked neatly beside her shed door. No note, no word. But the gesture was enough to make her smile in the lantern light. For the first time in years, a sound had returned to the ranch yard that had been missing Abigail's laughter. And Clara, though she told herself not to hope, began to feel that maybe the silence inside her was breaking too. The days that followed carried a new kind of quiet on the Hayes Ranch. It was no longer the suffocating silence of grief, but something gentler, like a still pond that had finally begun to ripple. Abigail no longer stayed only at the edge of the barnyard. Sometimes she drifted closer to Clara's oven, her doll cradled under one arm, her small fingers brushing flour across the dough with shy confidence. Though she rarely spoke, her presence filled the air differently now. She wasn't just watching, she was taking part. Samuel noticed. He didn't acknowledge it with words, but in the way of men who lived more in action than the speech, he began to leave small tokens of care. A neatly stacked pile of wood at Clara's door, a bundle of clean water buckets, a coat repaired at the seam quietly hung on a hook in her shed. Clara never confronted him about these gestures, but she noticed every one, and each left her heart unsteady in a way she hadn't felt in years. One evening, after a long day's baking, there was a knock on Clara's door. She opened it to find Samuel standing there, hat in hand, his voice gruff as ever. She laughed, he said. Clara's throat tightened. She nodded once. She did. He stared at the ground for a long time before lifting his eyes. She hasn't made a sound in a year. Not one. Clara spoke softly. I didn't try to make her. That's probably why it happened, Samuel replied, and then turned away before she could answer. Clara closed the door, her heart trembling at the weight of his words, but whispers of change didn't stop at the ranch fence. Townsfolk had sharp eyes and sharper tongues. By the second Saturday market, Clara could feel them staring. A widowed rancher with a silent child and a young woman not kin living by his barn. The gossip stirred like wildfire. Grace Evans, the preacher's daughter from Kansas, who had run off. What was she doing here? What place did she have on Samuel Hayes's land? Clara ignored the whispers, focusing on her work. She baked for the market, sold bread to families who smiled politely, but muttered when her back was turned. Samuel said nothing about the talk, though she could see in the tightening of his jaw that he had heard it too. The ranch hands, loyal to Samuel, kept their distance from the rumors, but they too watched with curiosity when Clara passed. Then, one afternoon, gossip arrived in flesh and blood. His name was William Grant, a blacksmith by trade and a brute by nature. He rode into the ranch yard, coated in dust temper, sharp as iron, his eyes burning with something far darker than curiosity. Clara saw him before anyone else, her stomach tightening. She had known him in Kansas. He had asked her hand twice, demanded it really, and she had refused him both times. When she left, she hadn't told him where she was going. Yet here he stood, dismounting his horse, like a storm breaking across the land. So, this is where you've been hiding? William sneered, stomping across the dirt toward her, playing house with a rancher and his brat. Clara straightened, clutching a tray of fresh loaves against her chest. I told you I was done, William. That should have been the end of it, he spat. But you left me without a word. Because no word would have stopped you, she said firmly, though her heart pounded. He stepped closer, his voice rising. You think you're better now, living here like some secret wife. She's not yours. Samuel's voice cut in deep and even. He had been mending a fence post nearby, and now he strode forward, placing himself between Clara and William. William's laugh was ugly sharp. So, she's yours then. This is not your place, Clara said quickly, trying to step between them. Leave William. But his hand came fast. The crack echoed through the yard as he struck her across the face. Clara staggered back the tray, crashing to the ground, loaves scattering in the dirt. Abigail's scream pierced the air raw, broken the sound of a child terrified beyond words. Samuel didn't hesitate. He moved like something unchained. The first punch sent William reeling, dust exploding beneath their boots as fists flew. Samuel's fury was a storm, silent, relentless. William swung a plank, striking Samuel's shoulder, but Samuel answered with a blow to his gut, then his jaw. Blood sprayed and shouts filled the air as ranch hands rushed from the barn. Clara tried to step forward, but Abigail clung to her skirt, sobbing into the fabric, begging without words for her not to move. William scrambled his hand, reaching for the chopping block fingers closing around the handle of the axe. Clara's breath caught. "No," she cried. Before William could swing, Clara hurled herself forward, arms outstretched between the men. "Stop!" Samuel lunged at the same instant, tackling William from behind. He wrenched the axe free and slammed him into the dirt. Samuel's chest heaved, his voice breaking through the chaos like thunder. "Get off my land. If I see you near her again, you won't walk away." William spat blood, glaring at them both, but he stumbled to his horse and rode off without another word. The yard fell into silence, broken only by Abigail's sobs. Clara stood shaking her lip, split her hair tangled by the wind. Samuel turned slowly, blood trickling from a cut near his temple, his eye already swelling. His gaze locked with hers. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Samuel's voice came low, ragged. "You can leave if you want, but if you stay, don't leave me again." Clara swallowed hard tears, stinging her eyes. "I've never seen anyone fight for me without asking for something back." His voice cracked. "I'm not asking." Slowly, she stepped forward, reaching for his hand. He didn't pull away. Their fingers met, rough and trembling, and though neither smiled, something passed between them, something fierce, wordless, and real. As the sun sank over the ridge, the yard lay scattered with broken bread blood in the dirt, and two battered hearts standing together, bound not by promises, but by the fire they had just walked through. Evening settled over the ranch with a quiet that felt different than before. The dust from the fight had been swept away, but its weight lingered in every breath. Samuel Hayes sat on a rough wooden stool outside Clara's shed, his shirt stripped off, a wet cloth pressed against his bruised shoulder. A streak of blood clung to his collarbone, drying in a thin line. Clara knelt beside him, her hands steady, even as her heart trembled from the memory of the axe, from how close everything had come to ending in violence. She dabbed gently at the cut on his temple, the cloth turning dark as it soaked up blood. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence wasn't heavy. It was tender, like the hush that follows a final hymn in a small church when everyone lingers in reverence. Clara focused on his wounds, her fingers moving with care. Samuel kept still, though every press must have burned. "You should have let me finish it," he muttered at last, his voice gravel low. Clara shook her head, not looking up. "You did finish it. You're still here. That's enough." He turned his gaze toward her, then sharp but softened by something she hadn't seen before. Before he could speak, a small shuffle came from behind them. Clara glanced back and saw Abigail standing barefoot in the dirt, her doll dangling from one hand. The girl hovered for a moment, then stepped forward. Without a word, she placed her tiny hand in Clara's free one. Clara froze the wet cloth still in her other hand. Slowly, she turned her eyes toward the child. Abigail looked up, her wide eyes full of something unspoken, and then, soft and clear as spring water, she whispered two words that cleaved through the night. "Mama, bake." The world seemed to stop moving. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Samuel's head turned sharply, his body still, his face unreadable except for the way his throat tightened, the way his eyes shone in the lantern glow. Abigail clung to Clara's hand, her small voice echoing in the stillness, as if the very land had been waiting for it. Later that night, Abigail curled up at the foot of Clara's bed, her doll tucked beneath her chin. Clara sat beside her with a worn book of fairy tales she had found in one of Samuel's old trunks. She read softly, her voice steady, watching the child's eyes grow heavy. For the first time since arriving, Clara saw Abigail fall asleep without tears or fear. She brushed a stray curl from the girl's forehead and whispered, "Good night, sweetheart." Outside, the crickets sang. Inside, the shed felt more like a home than Clara had ever dared imagine. The next morning, Clara moved through her chores with hands steadier than before. Her thoughts kept drifting to the sound of Abigail's voice, so small, so fragile, yet strong enough to stitch together something that had been broken for far too long. A knock sounded at the shed door. Clara turned flour, dusting her fingers to find Samuel standing there. He had cleaned himself up, his shirt, scrubbed his hair, combed back as if he'd spent longer than usual preparing for this moment. His knuckles were still bruised, but his stance carried something new, a quiet determination. "I brought something," he said simply. Clara wiped her hands and stepped closer. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in plain cloth tied with fraying string. He held it out, his expression unreadable. Clara untied the knot and peeled back the cloth. Inside lay a silver ring, tarnished but beautiful, engraved with delicate patterns of vines and flowers. "It was my mother's," Samuel said, his voice low. "She wore it until the day she passed. Said no woman should be without something of her own." Clara's breath caught as she held the ring in her palm. "I don't have speeches," Samuel continued, shifting uneasily. "No poetry. I can't tell you you're the answer to prayers. I don't even know if I've prayed since Martha died. But you're here." And she laughed. "And I haven't felt this kind of quiet in years, the kind that lets a man breathe." Clara's chest rose with a slow inhale. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a little loose, but it rested there like it had been waiting all along. She took his hand, her voice trembling. "You didn't ask a question." "I don't need to," he replied. Their eyes locked. No vows spoken, no grand gestures. Yet in that gaze and the way her fingers curled around his, every promise was made. Samuel leaned in, pressing his lips to her forehead, not a kiss of passion, but one of reverence, of blessing. Clara closed her eyes, her heart steady. "I wasn't looking to be held by anyone," she whispered. "But you didn't reach for me. You just stood still and let me come close." He nodded once, as though to say that was enough. Outside, the prairie wind shifted, rustling through the grass, carrying away the last remnants of doubt. The wedding came quietly on a Tuesday morning. No preacher, no lace, no music. The meadow behind the ranch had burned weeks before, its ground still scarred with ash, but wild daisies had begun to push stubbornly through the blackened earth. Clara wore a cream-colored dress that had once belonged to Samuel's mother, its hem mended with lace from an old pillowcase. Her hair was braided down her back, tied with a simple ribbon. Samuel stood opposite her, freshly shaved but still himself, boot-scuffed collar imperfect. The silver ring on Clara's finger glinted in the sunlight, a symbol of something stronger than words. Between them stood Abigail, dressed in white, carrying a crooked heart-shaped loaf of bread she had shaped the night before with Clara's help. She placed it carefully on a bench set between two trees, her small smile brighter than any jewel. The townsfolk came, some out of curiosity, others out of quiet admiration. Whispers that once carried judgment now held something softer. A widowed schoolteacher dabbed her eyes with a shawl. Ranch hands stood near the back, hats in hand. Even the mayor appeared nodding respectfully. When it came time, Samuel simply held both of Clara's hands and nodded once. She whispered, "Yes." Her voice thick with tears, as though she had already spoken it 100 times in her heart. Abigail reached up, pressing their hands together over the loaf of bread. The crowd clapped softly, and the only sound that followed was the breeze through the trees. In that moment, there was no grief, no loneliness, only three people who had found home in each other. 1 year later, the Hayes Ranch no longer looked like the same place Clara had first stepped into with little more than a satchel and weary hands. Where the old cattle shed once leaned forgotten, a new building stood proudly, its wood painted white, its windows wide and bright. From its open door drifted the scent of yeast and honey, warm enough to stop any passerby on the dusty road. A carved sign hung above the entryway, simple yet full of meaning, the bread camp. Inside, flour floated in the morning sunlight like snowflakes caught midair. 10 children sat at sturdy benches, their sleeves rolled, their hands covered in dough. Some were from town, some from outlying farms, but all of them carried a silence that Clara knew too well. Some hadn't spoken since a death in the family, others had retreated into wordless shadows after illness or loss. Clara moved among them with calm assurance, apron tied snug, her voice gentle as she guided their hands press-fold kneed. The dough didn't just rise in their palms, hope did too. Samuel had quietly converted the barn's back room into a small library, filling it with shelves of donated books and a rocking chair by a potbelly stove. On colder days, the children took turns reading aloud while loaves baked next door. Samuel didn't hover, didn't intrude. He simply carved small wooden animals in silence, leaving them tucked beneath benches for children to discover like treasures. But the heart of it all was Abigail. Once silent as stone, she was now the brightest voice in the bread camp. She read aloud at story hour, taught the younger ones to shape stars and animals from dough, and sometimes corrected Clara's signing with a playful grin. At night, she curled against her mother because that was what Clara had become without ever needing to ask, and whispered questions about clouds, horses, and dreams. Each question was proof of how far she had come. One autumn afternoon, a letter arrived in careful handwriting. Clara read it by lamplight, her voice catching as she spoke the words aloud to Samuel and Abigail. Dear Mrs. Hayes, my son has not spoken since his father died last spring. Yesterday, we stopped by your ranch, and you gave him a roll warm from your oven. That night, before bed, he asked me, his voice small but clear, "Mama, is she an angel?" I cried, not because of what he said, but because of the hope in his voice. Thank you, Rebecca Linwood. Tears blurred Clara's vision as she finished. Abigail pressed her cheek against Clara's shoulder, clutching the little wooden bear Samuel had carved for her birthday. Samuel sat in his chair, arms resting along the back, his gaze fixed on the fire. He didn't speak, but his silence was full of pride, full of something deeper than words could carry. Later, when the house had grown quiet, Clara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. His hand found hers, rough fingers wrapping gently around her flour-stained ones. Abigail stirred in her sleep and whispered drowsily, "Mama, can we make cinnamon rolls tomorrow?" Clara smiled softly into the hush. "Of course, sweetheart." The flames crackled, shadows danced on the walls, and Samuel's voice rumbled low, almost as if he were speaking only to himself. "I hired you to bake bread, but you baked my soul back to life." Clara's breath caught, but she didn't answer. She only squeezed his hand. Some moments didn't need words. Some moments lived in the warmth of a fire, the smell of bread rising and the weight of a child's laughter filling spaces once empty. Outside, stars bloomed across the night sky. Inside, grief no longer ruled the Hayes Ranch. What had once been a place of silence and loss had become a home of voices, of laughter, of healing. The lesson was simple. though it had taken the hardest roads to reach. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder or grand declarations. Sometimes it grows slowly, like dough left to rise in the warmth of an oven, quiet, steady, unseen, until suddenly it is everything. And in that shed-turned home, Samuel, Clara, and Abigail built something whole out of ashes and bread. No bullets, no speeches, just small choices, steady hands, and the courage to stay. Dear listener, if this story stirred something in you, let it be. This healing often comes not in grand gestures, but in quiet faithfulness. The smallest kindness, a loaf left on a porch rail, a hand held in silence, can change everything. We all carry scars, but when we choose to stand by one another, even in wordless ways, brokenness gives way to belonging. Tell me in the comments, what's one quiet act of kindness that changed your life? And if you want more stories of love and resilience born from dust and hope, don't forget to subscribe. Out here on the edge of the world, love always finds a way.